Hi there, welcome to Module 13. This module we will focus on responding to student behavior. We are super close to the end of the semester. This is actually our last audio lecture for the semester because our next 2 weeks we will have an immersion week, and then our final week will be your final presentation. So this is the last time you will have to listen to me in an audio lecture if you choose to listen to these each week. I really do hope they've been helpful. So this will be a pretty quick lecture. I'll talk about ways to respond to student behavior, and then end with some wrap-ups and some reminders for the end of the semester. So the first thing related to behavior is really thinking about what is behavior. So I would like for you to all just pause for a second and think about how you define or describe behavior. What characterizes behavior? Okay. And so one of the things that we know is that all behavior, I might be skipping ahead here because behavior is one of my favorite topics. I'm a behaviorist by training, and so pardon me if I jump ahead for some slides. But one of the things that we know about behavior is that it is literally anything that you do. Excuse me. Behavior is anything that we do, and all behavior is learned. And so there's always a function of behavior, right? So when you think about students who engage in aggressive behavior, when you think about babies who are crying, when you think about, people, even adults who get into a fight, or if you think about a student throwing a chair in the classroom, whatever the action may be, even if it's not an aggressive behavior, if you think about someone who is withdrawn or someone who, chooses not to raise their hand in classroom, all things are, anything we do is a behavior. And so you have to think very closely and reflect on what the functions of those behaviors are, especially when working with students with disabilities, so that you can better address their needs. So this link takes you to a video that talks more about the functions of behavior and how all behavior is communication. So take a look at that, and then jump back in to our presentation. So after you watch the video, I want you to think about some of your concerns related to managing behavior in your classrooms. What behavior management strategies have you and either your mentor teacher, if you're currently in a placement, or in your own classroom, what have you employed over the course of the semester, and did they work? And then also think about the extent to which you have been able to identify strategies that are beneficial for all of your students. So I know in many of your reflections throughout the semester, a lot of you have had concerns about kind of how to differentiate your strategies and supports for students with and without disabilities. And I think some of you had concerns related to essentially inequities in the way that you teach, right? So like, how, Dr. P, how can I, make sure that a student who has more significant learning needs acquire the same material as a student who is gifted? And so those same questions can apply to students who have behavior challenges or behavior needs. But one of the big goals here is to implement classroom-wide strategies that can support all of your learners. So think about strategies that you have identified that have either been beneficial for all of your learners, or ones that you think might be beneficial for all of the students in your classroom. So when you're thinking about ways to respond to student behavior, we know that discipline is primarily about learning and not so much about obedience or control. And so as you saw in the video, all behavior is communication, and all behavior is learned. So no matter what it is, what someone is doing, they've learned that behavior from some previous experience. And in many cases, teachers have teacher beliefs have a cultural component. So you have to really self-monitor your own beliefs. You have to check those implicit biases at the door. You really want to think carefully about how your discipline practices in your classroom are sort of impacted by beliefs or implicit biases that you bring to the table. So you really want to check those at the door, and you want to make sure that you are applying your discipline practices fairly and evenly across your students. So many of you might be using MTSS or PBIS in your classrooms currently. It's going to be a statewide, it's going to be implemented and required statewide beginning in 2021. But the multi-tiered systems of support is designed to help students, A, get supports that they need at a tiered level that's appropriate for their needs without necessarily being directly referred to special education services, and B, to help manage behavior on a school-wide level. So you can see that at Tier 1, all students in all settings receive the school-wide culturally responsive supports. And then at Tier 2, you might have students who are in smaller group settings who get needs that are more specific to their level, get interventions more specific to their needs. And then in Tier 3, or tertiary prevention, this is where we have really specific sort of one-on-one individualized supports for students who have high risk, what we call high risk behaviors, or students whose behaviors are so significant that they are really impacting their ability to learn in the general education classroom. And it's after this point, not before, but after you have implemented strategies in your own classroom or with the help of special educators or with the help of related service providers, if you have a student who gets to Tier 3 and those interventions are still not effective, then we think about referring them on to special education. So historically, what has happened in education in our country is that we've sort of not had this model, and we've not used any model like this, and we've said, oh, this kid is acting out, they need to be in special education. And over time, we've seen an overrepresentation of young boys of color, particularly African American boys, who are in special education classrooms, specifically behavioral classrooms, because their behavior was communicating something that wasn't clear to the teacher. And that behavior could have been aggressive behavior, it could have been depressive behavior, it could have been, hyperactivity, etc. And so instead of teachers and administrators or whoever, instead of those professionals really trying to understand what the behavior was communicating, they automatically referred them to special education. And in many cases, it wasn't necessary. The same applies for students who are English language learners. So historically, we have been referring students who, for example, speak Spanish, because there are many Spanish-speaking students in our country, and especially here in our area in North Carolina. They have been traditionally overrepresented in special education because of the language barriers, and not because of deficits in their learning abilities, right? And so this is what I'm saying when I say respond to student behavior with culturally competent practices. So you don't want to assume that because a student is not reading quote unquote on grade level that they automatically need to be in special education. You first have to decide and assess the extent to which their access to the language is really impeding their ability to read versus the cognitive abilities, right? So if it's a language barrier, then that's something we need to work on in a bilingual classroom or work on in ELL, right? So we have to find ways to accommodate students in that regard. And so a lot of the behavior piece really goes back to language, because all behavior is communication. And I think when you think about it that way, it helps you to really reflect and say, wait a minute, what is this student really trying to tell me? So how can you manage behavior for effective classroom learning? One of those ways is to treat students with respect and trust. It sounds simple, but it's a really great strategy to build rapport with your students and to help them understand and trust you while you're in the classroom. Teacher-student communication is complex, so sometimes there are language differences. Sometimes you have students who, as many of you identified in your disability investigations, those who are deaf or hard of hearing. There may be some miscommunications in those ways, so you want to be really clear, even though the communication can be complex. You want to make time for individual talks and positive comments. Again, this sounds so simple. You're like, duh, Dr. P, we already do this. But you guys probably don't realize just how effective positive praise can be, especially for students who are already struggling with behavior. So when you say, hey, Jacob, you are doing a great job, staying in your seat during X, Y, and Z, or Natalie, I really love the way that you are working together with your peers, right? Those simple positive praises or simple positive reinforcement can be really, really effective for managing student behavior. And then finally, you want to have effective teaching methods. So this is especially important for students who tend to not be engaged or tend to be overactive or hyperactive, students who have ADHD, students who have oppositional defiant disorder. You really want to have teaching methods that enables them to sort of engage in a way that's most appropriate, but is also matching the function of their behavior. And we'll talk again in a few seconds about what function of behavior means and how you can target that piece in the classroom. So other strategies include fostering positive student interactions. So you want to provide ways for students to interact with each other in addition to interacting with you, and you want to create space for special programs. So a lot of times students are also very motivated by the opportunity to be a classroom leader, right? Or to even go run an errand. So think about a student who is super hyperactive, they aren't able to stay in their seat. Instead of punishing them and saying, all right, Jacob, this is the 12th time I've told you to stay in your seat, it's obvious that he needs a break. So one thing that you could do is say, hey, Jacob, can you run this errand for me, right? Now, that means that you're doing a few things. You are building trust in the student. You recognize that his behavior is communicating something to you, and then you're giving him an opportunity to sort of get some of that energy out. So ideally, when he comes back to the classroom from running that errand, he's able to refocus, okay? If you punish him or discipline him, say, that's 10 minutes off your recess time, you're still going to have to kind of deal with his hyperactivity for the next X number of minutes. So you are not targeting the function of that behavior. When we say function, you are identifying the sort of root cause as to why the behavior is occurring, and then you find a replacement behavior or replacement strategy that still matches the function of the challenging behavior. We also have some school-wide strategies that can be especially helpful, such as like your different acronyms that you have at your school for your PBIS. Maybe if you will pause here and just think of some of those. If you don't already know your school PBIS acronym, then maybe look it up. But I know, for example, like there's one school that I was in that the school-wide acronym was RESPECT, and each letter represented a different skill, strategy, or sort of, just kind of an overarching rule that each student agreed to abide by as it relates to their positive behavior. And then again, it's important to have location-specific rules. As you know, during transitions, behaviors can occur that are often not as positive as we would like them to be. Sometimes students might get more rowdy in the cafeteria, for example, or different behaviors occur during recess or during transition to the buses in the afternoons. And so you really want to think about which rules are most appropriate for specific settings. Another strategy is to avoid bringing out negative behaviors and really to avoid responding too much to those negative behaviors. And so if you do the reverse, what you would ultimately like to do is catch your students being good. So although Kevin has been super hyperactive, interrupting you while you're trying to present your lesson, interrupting peers, but then you see that he is engaged in his reading activity, or that he's sharing his materials with his peers, or that he's turned his homework on time for the first time in several days, you really want to reward those appropriate behaviors so that it increases the likelihood of those appropriate behaviors occurring again in the future. And so those are really, really important strategies to focus on catch them being good instead of punishing them when those less preferred or maladaptive behaviors are happening. And then finally, you want to manage student surface behaviors. So you can find ways to use humor that's still appropriate for students and still a way to manage behaviors in the classroom. So students with oppositional defiant disorder, depending on their level of aggression or depending on their level of depression or depending on their level of mental health, mental illness, and basically their needs in the classroom, they may or may not be in the general education classroom for much of the day. However, I use that particular category of students as an example because they can be quite hilarious. Like, students with ODD tend to curse a lot. They tend to be hyperactive. Sometimes don't want to be engaged in the content. And so personally for me, like, I really struggle not to laugh because they say hilarious things, but they catch you off guard. And so you have to just find ways to not take so much offense to that and just kind of roll with it, because it does a few things. If you roll with it, you build rapport with the student, which over time helps you to actually be able to shape some of the behaviors. B, it doesn't become quite as much of a distraction in the classroom, so you don't want to necessarily reinforce inappropriate comments. But if every time the student says damn, you make a big deal out of it, it becomes more of a distraction to the rest of the students than it necessarily needs to be. So you have to find a balance between, okay, am I going to stop and discipline, Tony every time he says damn, or am I going to continue with my lesson and ignore it? Okay, ignoring maladaptive behaviors is one of the most effective ways to extinguish those behaviors, which means to make them stop, but it's also one of, if not the most difficult behavior management strategy to implement, because ignoring something is very difficult, right? Like, to completely ignore somebody every time they say damn, it sounds absurd. And what happens is, with ignoring, you typically have what we call an extinction burst. So when you ignore Tony because he says, damn it, every 5 seconds, he's not getting the attention, right? When you actually acknowledge and say, Tony, I told you yesterday to stop saying damn, he actually is reinforced by you giving him that attention. So let's say that we understand that the function of Tony's behavior, the function of Tony saying damn every 5 minutes or damn it every 5 minutes is to get attention. Well, you just gave him that attention, right? So when you ignore Tony saying damn it every 5 minutes, you're no longer giving him that attention. So he's going to get quite frustrated and he's going to start saying damn it, 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 even more often. And that's what we call an extinction burst. So before the behavior goes on extinction, it actually increases. And you have to be very, very, very persistent with your ignoring strategy so that the behavior actually does go on extinction. So it can be quite frustrating, quite hard to stick to, but also very, very effective when implemented appropriately. And so I kind of got off on a little tangent there, but ignoring minor incidents is a really good strategy. And it's more than just ignoring minor incidents. It's implementing a behavior management strategy that's super effective. So now we have more on understanding functions of behaviors. So when you view student behaviors as serving a function, you are saying, okay, I recognize that these behaviors are A, communicating something to me, and B, that they have meaning, right? So there's a need that's being met by whatever this behavior is. And functions can involve avoiding something or getting something. So typically students are, avoiding having to do something that is aversive to them, or they want to get something like, say, attention, or to take a break, or they're hungry. Even when you think about babies crying, they're either wanting to get a nasty diaper off or they're wanting to get food in their bellies, right? So they're avoiding something or they're wanting to get something. Focusing on the function helps to identify the problem. So you're not just using your same strategy of saying, Tony, that's another point off, or that's 5 more minutes off of timeout, off of recess. But you're focusing on really identifying the actual problem, which is the fact that Tony likes receiving attention. So maybe you can turn that into a more positive way. Hey, you can earn your chance to lead the classroom in X, Y, and Z. Or if you want attention, you can walk up and deliver this to the principal, etc. Those sorts of ways, those sorts of strategies that still address the function of the behavior. You can avoid responding to symptoms of the behavior. So the example I just gave you with the curse words. You can look for patterns rather than reacting to surface behavior. So if it's, the cursing, what else is a pattern in this, and what really is happening? What's deeper than just these curse words every 5 minutes? And it really takes time and effort to understand the function of behaviors. And so being able to observe behaviors over time helps you to learn how to implement more effective behavioral interventions. So I don't expect that you will walk away from this one lecture and be able to implement a functional behavioral assessment in full or even in part, but these are ways that you can do so. And so I'll let you read through those steps. But essentially, you are engaging in a strategy for collecting data that helps you to better understand why the behavior is occurring the way that it is. And so many of you as gen ed teachers will likely not be conducting FBAs, but this helps you to be familiar with them when and if you work with a special educator who's coming in to conduct a functional behavioral assessment. These are other steps. We haven't talked a whole lot about behavior intervention plans in this classroom, but you might have some students who do not have an IEP or even a 504 plan, but they do have a behavior intervention plan in place, and so you should be aware of that. And you should know what the strategies and the consequences are for students who have BIPs, so that you know how to respond, because you have to be consistent with the way that you respond to their behaviors across the settings, across classrooms, to really make those plans effective. So you can pause here for a quick break if you need, and then we'll keep going. So responding to student behavior. Positive reinforcement is one of, if not the best way to increase desired behavior. So anything that you do to increase a positive behavior, anything you do to increase a desired behavior is positive reinforcement. Now, the caveat to positive reinforcement is that sometimes we inadvertently reinforce behavior that we don't necessarily mean to, right? So let's say, for example, that Jackie throws her paper and pencil on the floor every time you give her a double-digit multiplication worksheet, right? And her function of that behavior is seeking attention. Or no, let's say her function of the behavior is avoiding the math because it's too difficult, right? So you actually positively reinforce Jackie by not having her complete the worksheet. And you say, okay, Jackie, that's 5 minutes off of your recess time if your students still have recess. Well, in Jackie's mind, that's actually fine with her, because she's like, whatever, 5 minutes off of recess is nothing because I don't have to do this worksheet that is super difficult. So you're actually positively reinforcing her maladaptive behavior, or her throwing the paper and pencil on the floor, okay? Negative reinforcement is any increase in desired behavior that is a result of avoiding a consequence. So when you negatively reinforce someone, you are still increasing the behavior, but they are trying to, the function of that behavior is to avoid a specific consequence, okay? So some types of reinforcers include social. So that might be like you can hang out with your friends, you could sit with a preferred peer at lunch, etc. It might be an activity. It could be a tangible item. So for young kids, a lot of times this ends up being snacks. It could be, when you think about adults, as an example, we are often reinforced by paychecks, right? When you think about, why do I go to work every day? hopefully for many of you, it's because you enjoy your job, but ultimately you get a paycheck, right? And you're positively reinforced by that. So when you use positive reinforcers effectively, you make sure that they are clear, specific, and students understand the link between the reward and the behavior. If your students don't understand the link between the reward and the behavior, your intervention is sort of useless, okay? You want to make sure that you vary the amount and the frequency of the reward. So this is called varied reinforcement or variable reinforcement because you don't want to give them a chance to get used to kind of the pattern in which they're reinforced. And then you want to make sure that the student has earned the reward. So you don't want to go and start giving reinforcement for a behavior that does not actually match the requirements. Differential reinforcement is another way to manage behavior. And in this regard, students who have inappropriate behaviors, you can help decrease those by increasing the related appropriate behaviors by reinforcement. So if the student has a problem with outbursts in the classroom, you positively reinforce them when they don't have outbursts. Micah, I love that you were able to sit through this reading group without having any outbursts. Here is your preferred reinforcement. You are positively reinforcing the preferred behavior and essentially ignoring the negative behavior. And by doing so, you actually decrease the negative behavior and you increase the preferred behavior. Okay. You stop reinforcing a behavior and eventually it will decrease. Again, I talked about this earlier, so it will likely increase first. That's that extinction burst. And then removing reinforcers, this is called response cost. So if you take away a privilege such as sitting with a preferred peer or a reward, then this is called a response cost. And this can sometimes also result in something that looks similar to an extinction burst. Timeout is another way to remove reinforcers. So you remove that opportunity for a reward. We don't really use timeout in schools anymore, but I leave it as an example in this lecture so that you can kind of wrap your head around what it would look like to remove reinforcers. But response cost is a more appropriate term to use in the classroom because you're thinking about what it is that it will essentially cost the student for engaging in that behavior. So speaking of timeout, is it appropriate? Why do we use it? Is it okay to use? In some schools, it's prohibited, so that's one thing to acknowledge. Obviously, if it's prohibited in your school, then you don't want to be using timeout. Many early educators still use timeouts in schools. And again, there's some data, some research that goes against the use of timeout. I think essentially it's kind of a case-by-case basis, and it's hard for parents who are also teachers to kind of think about their use of timeout at home versus in their classrooms. But if timeout is something that is used in your setting, it's only effective if the student was being reinforced by activities in the class. If they weren't being reinforced, then timeout is actually a good thing for them. So remember the example I gave earlier for the student who threw her paper on the floor? She didn't want to do that work anyways. So if you send her to timeout for not doing her math worksheet, you're really reinforcing that behavior. So hopefully that helps you to start seeing some of those connections. A good strategy, especially for students in middle grades, is to come up with a behavior contract. So when you have students who have really been struggling, but you see that there's lots of potential for them to make strides, then you develop a behavior contract, which is essentially an agreement between you and the student that really explains what your expectations for them are, what they are rewarded with for meeting those expectations, and then you identify the consequences for not meeting those expectations and the time frame for which the agreement is valid. So it might be for a month, it might be for the entire semester, but you really lay those things out, and they can be super, super effective, and students are often motivated by the rewards that they get to receive for meeting the expectations on their behavior contract. So in your weekly reflection for this week, I've asked you to design a tool that you can use in your own classrooms, either currently or in the future, that can help you to manage behavior. And one of those things that you can develop is a behavior contract. So I would encourage you to develop a sample behavior contract that you could use with your students if you think that would be helpful for you. So here are some more pieces, some of the additional components of behavior contracts. I'm not going to go into full details on these because I'm already way over the time that I thought, but we are close to the end. So if you'd like to learn more about behavior management, I think I mentioned at the beginning of this class that I teach an entire class for special education students just on behavior. And so you can access a module on classroom and behavior management from my other class that I teach just on behavior by clicking on this link, and that will take you to the slides for that module, which is a different classroom. So I might use some references to like some different assignments or something like that, but overall the content, actually I don't think it's the audio module, so it doesn't matter. You'll just have the slides, which might be helpful if you want to learn a few more strategies or more details about ways to manage behavior. If you like some additional support, you can also see the IRIS module linked here if you click on the photo, and you can get some more examples, some scenarios that really walk you through ways to manage behavior within the classroom, learning components of comprehensive behavior management. All right, so a couple reminders as we wrap up. Next week will be our second and final immersion experience. I know there was some confusion and a little bit of, difficulty with the first one, just not knowing quite what to expect. So I'm trying to set this one up a bit better so that you understand more clearly what the expectations are going into the experience. So our immersion experience will be November 26th, 27th, and 28th. Most of you have signed up, but not everyone. So if you have not signed up, please, please, please sign up as soon as possible at the link here. And then you can also review the scenario synopsis and goals, which are on the slide, but also linked here. And if you read through, you can kind of get a better understanding of what the expectations are of you, right? So in this simulation, we're going to work on classroom management, and you will gain the avatars or your students' attention by using a consistent learning signal. So you can go ahead and kind of brainstorm what you want that signal to be. And your learner, so you will have the opportunity to work with the students to establish group expectations for behavior during small group work. So you're really setting the stage for what you want your students to do, okay? So you can read through the challenge, think about how you will plan your experience. We'll do the same thing. You'll have about 5 minutes, and you won't necessarily have to do so much of the content focus like last time with the solar system, but this time it's more about setting the stage for managing behavior. And I will tell you, it's going to be a little more challenging in terms of how the students are behaving. So make sure you review this module, review some of the other behavior management strategies in advance so that you can try to implement some of those as we go throughout this experience. I'll likely send an email with a couple more updates. I need to finalize just a little bit of things kind of surrounding how we'll get it going. I need to check in with the immersion people to make sure we're all set with that. So if there's any additional information, I'll be sure to email that out in advance. But this scenario guide should really help you prepare and plan your 5-minute session in advance. So if you have additional questions about that, please let me know. And we are super close to the end, guys. So just wrap up for this week. Of course, you have chapter 12. Because it is Thanksgiving week, I'm going to give you a couple extra days to submit your weekly reflection, which is due on Wednesday, November 28th instead of Sunday. So you have a couple extra days for that. Again, your immersion week is coming up on the 26th through the 28th. Your final inclusive teaching guide is due on December 12th. However, your presentations are on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So even though the final guide is not due until the 12th, your presentations are quite a bit before that. So you can use the feedback that you get in the presentations to finalize the paper itself, but you want to make sure that you've done most of your presentation or most of your paper in advance so that you can actually have something to present. There were several of you who have not yet signed up for that, so please do so as soon as possible. There was one other reminder. Oh, your inclusive teaching proposals. I will get those graded in the next couple days so that you can use that feedback as you go into the actual assignment. And I'm about 3/4 of the way through your disability investigations. They have been really, really great. I'm really impressed with the work that many of you have done on those. And I apologize again for it taking so long. Most of them are closer to the 15-minute mark than the 10-minute mark, which is fine. But it's just taken me a while to get through, and I'm trying to give really kind of detailed feedback on that. So I'm getting close with those. Then I'll get your inclusion proposals back. I think I'm all caught up on all of your reflections. So by the time we come back from the Thanksgiving break, you should be all caught up with grades. I know some of you get a little anxious as it gets to the end of the semester about what your grades are looking like. So by the time you come back from the break, I hope to have everything caught up and you have a clear idea of what your grade is going into the final assignment. So if you have any questions about any of that, please let me know. And I think that's it. Again, this is our last audio lecture, unless I end up doing like one tiny reminder one at the end. So just as a reminder, please complete the course evaluation. I'd really appreciate your feedback on this course. As I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, this is my first time teaching this course in an online format, and so it'd be great to get some feedback on ways to strengthen that in the future. So I really appreciate your feedback on those evaluations. All right. That's all for me. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Enjoy your time with family and friends. And I will see all of you on the 26th, 27th, or the 28th for our next immersion experience. Thank you.